so marvelous.
Over to you, Danielle.
No, thank everybody here for attending this special evening. I want to thank the China Institute for hosting this with Sub China. I want to thank LUCKY Chow for all of your support over the years. Also to Radii for underwriting this season of Lucky Chow, and to Remy EXO for providing the liquid courage for all of us tonight. We have a wonderful discussion here tonight with all of our guests, so just really want to hand it all over to you guys right away. You know, as you saw, I was in China and also the US, and there really is this global exchange now of ideas through food, and all of you have chosen to come from China and start enterprises in the Asian food world, whereas, say, a generation or two ago, most of the Chinese who immigrated to the US were forced to work in kitchens or laundromats, stereotypically, so that children like us wouldn't have to work in the food world. What inspired you to kind of step back into the kitchen? Maybe we'll just go down the road here with Amelie first.
Hi, my name is Amelie, and originally, real name is Kang, and I came from Beijing to go to Culinary Institute of America. So I started my career as a chef, and 2014 I started my own restaurant called Málà Project. So far we have 3 Chinese restaurants in Manhattan at the moment.
My name is Jenny, and I am the founder of a company called Fly by Jing, and that is, the aim is really to bring the flavors of Sichuan to the world through a line of sauces and condiments and snacks. And I was born in Chengdu. I grew up moving around quite a bit, and mostly in Canada. And I found myself back in China at the age of maybe like, I think 19 or 20 in university, and just was blown away by how much about my own culture that I didn't know. And so I started to explore it mainly through food, and it was a way for me to get to know myself and my family through this language, common language of food. And it's been this like 10-year journey through since then of exploration, and I started just by reading as much as I could, writing about it. Eventually, it led to me opening a restaurant in Shanghai, and most recently, about a couple of years ago, I started working on this line of sauces, and I just launched my Sichuan chili sauce in the US a couple months ago. So, yeah, that's a good one.
My name is Lucas. I came to food by way of accident and necessity, I would say. I'm from Hong Kong originally. I'm the chef at Junzi Kitchen. We have 3 restaurants now. We're about to open our 4th one, fast casual restaurants. So our approach is pretty different from everybody else in the panel. Our goal is to make Chinese food an accurate representation of Chinese food, make it accessible for the American palate. Our idea is that there's a certain understanding of what Chinese food is supposed to be in a lot of Chinese chain restaurants, and we just want to keep adding to that color, and we want to update that palate. So at the restaurant we serve Northern Chinese food, which those of you who know China might realize has nothing to do with where I came from. I'm from the south, from Hong Kong, and for the longest time I had cooked Japanese food. I did all my culinary training in Japan, very fancy Japanese restaurants, because in my head the best food in the world was in Japan. So you go to Japan, you learn from the Japanese chefs, and you realize after a little while that perhaps there's something worth thinking about when you think about the food that's in your blood. So go back home, talk to my dad, and say, hey, you should really be thinking about this Chinese food too. And so I began thinking about it, met the other co-founders at Junzi when we were in school in New Haven, and eventually, for some reason, have opened 3 restaurants now, cooking Chinese food every single day of my life.
Well, I can kind of relate to your story because...
Start again, Doron.
Doron Wong from Rivers and Hills Hospitality. I can relate to where Lucas comes from. You know, I'm a little bit different. I was trained Western, then I went back to Hong Kong, Singapore, then I trained in the Eastern Kitchen. So I think my story is a little bit more reversed because I really wanted to get to understand where my culture's food came from, what I grew up eating. And I don't think my dad wanted me to be in the kitchen. And, he was in the restaurant business as well. And then he tried his best to keep me out of it. But for some reason, I guess it's in the genes to stay in the restaurant business.
You guys have all been super successful and impressive in terms of shifting our perceptions of what Chinese food is. I think that there's this kind of global Chinese cuisine and culture that has existed for so many decades everywhere around the world. Whether you're in Rome or you're in Jamaica, you're going to find a Chinese restaurant called Hunan Dynasty or Golden Wong or something like that serving a moose with pork. And that's done because the flavors have been, augmented or changed to cater to certain audiences. Do you find, how do you market to a U.S. Or a non-Chinese audience? Do you have to dumb down your flavors? Do you, I know Lucas has said that you stay as authentic as possible. How do you do that while marketing to people who didn't grow up with the same palate that we did?
So for us, we started to try to please Chinese in international students like myself. So we didn't try to change any flavors, used all the chicken hearts and tribes and gizzards as you can get in the dry pot. And it just happened so that it pleased the American market just as much as it pleased the Chinese market. And then I started thinking, if it's good food, it's good food, it's good food. So if the flavor is good, the heat is there, I think there's a universal language in food. So in terms of cuisine, I think there isn't really a need to, I guess, you only have to stay authentic to yourself in sort of way. So like if you wanted to do American Chinese food, stick with American Chinese food. And if you wanted to do authentic Chinese food, you're doing authentic Chinese food. So it's really, the authenticity is only speaking to yourself, and then it's a matter of how do you I guess, like transfer that dialogue to your audience.
Yeah, I would agree with Amelie. I think good food is good food. And, but I think prior to maybe like a few years ago in cities like New York and LA, like a lot of really, perceived like authentic or like really, local Chinese restaurants were inaccessible to a lot of people because they were maybe hidden deep in the SUV or like in Flushing and like, the menu was all in Chinese or, whatever. So I think in the last few years you've seen a lot more like younger generations of Chinese people, like everyone here who are, I think, to your point, translating the palate a little bit more to a Western audience. And I think, with my sauce as well, like I don't think that there's anything really adapted to a Western palate, but it's more how you kind of talk about it and have people kind of understand it, because a lot of the ingredients might seem very mysterious to someone who hasn't tasted it before.
I think one thing that Jing does really, really well is, actually, to step back in the day, when Chinese people started cooking for Americans, 1800s, 1850s or whatnot, you might have thought about opening a restaurant and building the menu as a linear experience. So that on one end is the Chinese palate, and the other end is the American palate. And somehow we would have to, as Chinese people, take this food and then find somewhere along this sort of like scale and drop yourself a pin and say, this is as Chinese as the food will get. And a lot of that was because the two customer groups for these Chinese restaurateurs was split up. It was a duality, it was either Chinese or not Chinese. But we now have the fortune of cooking in the best city in the world, with the best Chinese food in the US, in my opinion. And in New York City and metropolitan areas like this, a lot of our customers and our guests don't find themselves like either left or right. So as a result, the job of the restaurateur isn't to just ignore the preferences of customers, obviously, but it's less about sliding along the scale. It's more about picking and choosing what these customers might want to see. So chili oil is a really good example. Everyone likes spicy food suddenly in the last probably 30 years or so. And so when Jenny comes by and opens or makes the best chili oil universe, obviously people are going to like it because it's authentic and it's like proper, but she selected this specific time to give people this specific product. And for Junzi, what we're trying to do is, all we're trying to say is, Northern Chinese food is interesting too. A lot of the Chinese food that you know, Chinese American food, is rooted in Southern cooking techniques. There's an interesting world within China where we eat less rice, more flour and water, and so we'd like to cook based on those principles as well. And just by selecting and saying, hey, this is what we're going to do, we're going to do it as properly as we think it should be done proper, without sort of like compromising flavor, or compromising structure, or menus, or anything like that. I think you end up with a much more sort of authentic and proper and exciting sort of Chinese food landscape in the US.
I'm still trying to figure out what authentic food is. It's a real tough question. You know, what we think is authentic food, you know, we'll go back to China, different regions of China, and really explore and find out what the roots of this actual dish is. And in reality, that has already evolved. It evolves in time. And every time someone touches it, it evolves, you know. And then when we bring it back here to the States and we try to recreate something like that, it evolves again. But we try to evolve to kind of cater to everybody's palates. The soup dumplings in Shanghai, they're extremely sweet, you know. I don't think that there's a place here in New York that has that sweet of a soup dumpling. I think people would actually not think it's authentic because it's so sweet, but in reality it's actually sweet. So it's like, it's really hard. It's really
soup dumpling. I mean, soup dumpling is a really good example. I was thinking about soup dumplings recently, as we do. But you all have had a soup dumpling before. Probably a Shanghai style one, right? Very thin. It's like 3 folds or whatever. Din Tai Fung's best of all. So they make this soup dumpling, and we were cooking at the restaurant, and a friend of mine, a Scottish guy who was at a Georgian restaurant, came by and dropped off a little pint container and said, hey, try this dumpling. And it looks exactly like a soup dumpling from a Georgian restaurant. I don't know if you guys know what a kinkali, yeah, a kinkali is literally a soup dumpling. And I was like, what do you mean it's a soup dumpling? Like, you take a soup, it's gelatinized, you cube it up, you put it in the whatever, you spice a certain way, and the skin is a little different. It's boiled instead of steamed, so then it's a little thicker. But it's literally a soup dumpling. So we were eating this Georgian soup dumpling. Think about Shanghainese soup dumplings. Same technique, it's ridiculous. And so then we built a dinner around it, and one of the core dishes for this dinner was along the Silk Road. What we wanted to see is how that soup dumpling evolved as it moved westward. And so if you trace things like spices, so it's interesting to see where cumin comes and when cumin disappears along the spice road. It's interesting to see how fennel sometimes, or coriander, takes place with that cumin as that Silk Road splits northwards into Georgia or southwards into Afghani-style soup dumplings. It's really interesting, and if there's so many iterations of soup dumplings out there, there's no way that you can claim a certain food is more authentic than the other. It seems perhaps it's more culturally dominant, like the Shanghai soup dumpling, but not necessarily more authentic. So that always gives us something to think about. It's really difficult these days as a Chinese chef to claim that your food is authentic. Easier to claim whether it's traditional. I'm doing this as my grandmother would have done it. Or to say, hey, this restaurant is a little different from what you might expect if you're coming from such a place. So, I mean, a lot of it is language, but it's really important to think about these days.
Yeah, I think you guys are all right that authenticity really is a very personal concept, and it shouldn't be equated with quality. You know, people used to always, well, still do ask me, well, what's the most authentic Chinese restaurant in New York? And by that they mean, what's the best restaurant? And the two, you know, I usually would name a fusion cuisine restaurant as the best restaurant. And I have so many Jewish friends for whom, for instance, eating Chinese on Sundays or for Christmas is as authentic as it gets, because that's the heritage and the culture that they grew up with. So it is very, very personal. And I think that that's one of the misconceptions about Chinese food that we're all facing now in this industry. What other misconceptions, or to your minds, what are the biggest misconceptions that people have about Chinese food in America today?
Chinese food should be cheap. That's a really big one.
Yes, so to your point earlier about, authenticity equating quality, I've actually found that not to be the case. Like, if it's somehow fused with like a Western cuisine, somehow that is perceived to be higher quality, and people are willing to pay more for it. And so, like a product like mine, I've faced questions like, why is this Sichuan chili sauce expensive? Or, and having to explain actually the stuff that you get in the stores now are because of the hierarchy of taste and because of the fact that people are unwilling to pay for perceived, ethnic food. Chinese products are usually relegated to this like ambiguous ethnic section of grocery stores, or bottom shelf of like Chinatown grocery stores. And so, and because of that, I think for a very long time, Chinese food products haven't been able to kind of cross that chasm over into more premium priced items. And so it's sort of this catch-22 thing where producers are unable to use high quality ingredients in their products because they can't sell it for any higher price than like $2, $3. And so that's something that I'm working to fight right now through, being very clear in communicating why I choose the ingredients I choose and, what that does to the flavor and, so there's a provenance there, all the ingredients are very meticulously sourced in Sichuan, but it's not necessarily super authentic because you won't find that even in Sichuan. Because even in China, there's the same problem. People still, aren't, there's very few very like kind of premium food producers. And a lot of flavor shortcuts are still used, MSG, chicken powder, and things like that to add umami instead of actually building it, from scratch. So.
That cheap price tag that we're talking about, sometimes I think the other component to it is the other costs that are associated in the business of running food. So apart from the ingredient cost, another big one is your labor cost. So sometimes I think when we have these discussions, we also need to keep in mind the specific labor structure of Chinese restaurants that allow for them to have that specific, to charge that low of a cost for food. There's a very sophisticated, almost hidden labor network of people's cousins and people coming from just Fujian or whatever to like build these restaurants, and like it's actually pretty wonderful and amazing to look at. But if you're opening a new type of Chinese restaurant, you don't want to participate in that type of labor structure for whatever reason, then you have to take that into account. And sometimes I think it's difficult for Chinese restaurants like ours that are modern, that have chefs that trained at the CIA, or we want to be cooking not with somebody's cousin, but with people that live in the area that you hire, for example, with cooking Chinese food with American cooks. That means that you can't participate in that low-cost labor structure, ethical reasons aside. And it's hard to communicate those things to the customer. To say, hey, not only are we trying to use higher quality ingredients, we're trying to use a labor force that doesn't demand what laborers used to demand. So that's also something I like to keep in mind.
Yeah, and not only the chefs and also the servers. My favorite story is when people come in and they say, this is not a Chinese restaurant because you don't have anyone that speaks Chinese here. And I said, what do you mean? Because all of our servers are probably more educated about dry pot than you are. So that's just something, besides food itself, it's also the way that, I guess, the environment that it's presented in, how it's presented in. If it's pretty, it doesn't look authentic. If it's, if the servers speak perfect English, it doesn't seem authentic enough. And if you don't have duck sauce, it doesn't seem authentic enough. So there's a lot of but then if you actually strip away all of that and just look at the food itself, it's really hard to tell, and then it's harder to comment about authenticity. So it's more so about the people's perception about about this than the actual taste itself.
It really seems like as the new generation of Chinese food entrepreneurs, you guys are representatives, ambassadors for China itself, Chinese culture. I mean, what would you do differently if you took your projects back to China? Is that something that you think about doing, have on your mind?
This is really interesting because every time I go home, my mom would say something like this, and she always says it's going to be a big success if you start in the U.S. and bring it back to China, because when we wouldn't change anything about the food that we're doing here. If we bring it back to China, we would still be cooking the same food, same recipe, same technique, and everything. And in China, people actually have this expectation, and they have this need to have a more diverse, almost more diverse cultural background, even for a restaurant industry. So they love to hear about how Chinese restaurants are doing in the U.S. and love to hear about stories like that. And I don't think anyone has done that yet in China.
They tried to open that orange chicken place in Shanghai, right? You were there. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. They were trying to bring like American-style Chinese food to Shanghai, and people were like, "What is this?"
They also brought like juice press or salad bars back to China, and that didn't respond really well. But I feel like if you eat a Chinese restaurant, maybe I would be really interested in exploring that.
Okay.
Exchange is happening on the other side, though. You just saw Doron and a lot of other restaurants from China coming to the U.S. And as ambassadors, you have a lot to hold on your shoulders, so to say. What kind of value systems do you instill in your projects? And what do you want Western audiences or non-Chinese audiences to take away from these experiences that happen with your projects?
I don't know if you guys agree, I'm pretty sure we do. My core belief is Chinese food is the best food in the world. Like, straight up, no questions asked. I'd love for everybody to realize that too.
I agree.
Yeah, and like a lot of it is because every palate will find a place in some type of Chinese food. There's so much diversity, and just a tiny sliver has made its way over here. It's so exciting to see both, ABCs, American-born Chinese chefs who traditionally trained perhaps Western and now are realizing that they have the ability to cook their own food and people would appreciate it, but also to see big brands in China moving to the US and people like us who are immigrants in effect. And all three of these forces together will certainly add a lot more color to Chinese food in a very short amount of time.
Yeah, but I did it a little bit differently. We do have a couple of projects.
Use your mic, please.
We do have a couple of projects one in Taiwan and one in Kazakhstan. And we brought Western food to Taiwan, instead of bringing Chinese food back to, like our style of Chinese food back to Taiwan. Just because I didn't think that we're in the market to compete. We can offer them something a little bit different by bringing them the Western product. That's a little bit different kind of mindset. When I was in Kazakhstan a couple months ago, we actually opened up a Chinese restaurant in Kazakhstan. It is next to China, but it's pretty much blocked by the mountains. And there's no Chinese influence at all in that country. It's just very Russian. And for us to actually produce Chinese food there, it was very hard because the palate is very different still as well. They're so nomads, and the way they eat and the culture is very, very different. So yeah, so it's a little. It was definitely different. Yeah, but I wouldn't. I don't know if I would put a Northern Tiger in Hong Kong or a Lotus and Cleaver in Shanghai. I think it would be very tough.
Well, I could sit here and ask you guys questions all night, but I'm sure that there are lots in the audience as well. Should we open it up a little bit to the audience?
introduce yourself first?
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for this presentation. My name is
Oh, sorry.
Oh, yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
Hi, my name is John, and I'm a member here at the China Institute. I work in the mutual fund business, and my question comes from comments that Lucas, you made about how you capitalize on the trend toward going to spicy food, and then Doron, your comments around the evolution of cooking. So my question deals with how you handle changes as a business owner. Whether that be when you first started opening your first restaurant, was you expanded to build out your franchise. How did you realize to capitalize on those trends? And particularly, I'm curious about in today's environment where the new changes around tariffs, a lot of talk around trade war. We're already seeing in New York Times comments about how Chinese grocers are finding that to be more challenging. I was wondering, has that peaked to your own supply chain? And is that also something that you're dealing with in terms of handling those changes? Thank you if you could share those comments.
So the first question was about how we try to anticipate change and react to trends and that sort of thing. When you're trying to build a restaurant group, I think it's important to build versatility into the structure of the restaurant. That's got less to do with the food, less to do with even your recipes and your cooking process, more to do with the people that are making the food. So one thing that we do at Junzi is it's ridiculous. We only have 3 restaurants. Nobody knows why, but we have architects, graphic designers, operations, supply line managers, all of those things in-house. We believed in building a team like that had that versatility and that firepower, so to speak, so that the restaurant would continue to evolve. Obviously, even at a smaller scale, if we opened a restaurant in Philadelphia, it would not be exactly the same as the restaurant that we opened here in New York. Those small sort of geographical changes to what happens, right? Some people have asked us this before. If there's a trade war and you lose all your, all the ingredients that you had originally been importing, how would you pivot? You would need that team to be able to make that pivot. So that was important for us to build in the first day. And then for the supply line is, one wonderful thing that Lucky Chow showed earlier was that a lot of cooking in the US is based on a local forward type of movement. So a lot of our ingredients, especially all our fresh ingredients and certainly all our meats and things, should come locally. The only things that you really would have to rely on from importing from China are specific spices and sort of seasonings that evoke specific nostalgic points. So one thing that we do at the restaurant is we give out dabai tu, so the white rabbit candy. That has to be Chinese. Everyone's like, easy. Everyone's like, oh, yeah. Or for those of us from China, like the soy sauce we use haitian. We have to use haitian. That's the right one. We have to use the right soybean paste from Liu Yiju. You have to use the best chili oil. So, that's the stuff that might be eventually in danger, but those are staples, so trade wars and things don't really at this point yet.
As chefs, we're always evolving and changing and really going with, setting new trends and doing things differently to explore other flavors and different types of food. So we're constantly evolving as chefs. If I did stuff that I did 15 years ago, I don't think I'll survive. It's just not. You just got to keep it fresh and keep it kind of new. We've done Yunnan food, we've done Northern Chinese food, we've done Southern Chinese food. We covered quite a bit of a range in China. And that goes into the next question, where the supply chain. I generally kind of support our local farms, and a lot of my stuff comes from 100-mile radius. Even in Florida, we have our farms that we work with. Especially a lot of the Chinese farms are in Florida right now. And then when the season's open here in New York, we use all the line as well. Some of the stuff that Lucas was talking about, it's brand specific, soy sauce, bean paste, that stuff would definitely get impacted if there was some sort of,
hopefully not. Yeah. More soy sauce, yeah.
My name is David. Thank you for your presentation. My question is actually geared more towards the local. It's more of a local question. Anyone on the panel have a strong opinion or actually just insight as far as the evolutionary development or from a culinary perspective of New York's Chinatown? Do you think it's actually going to maintain its traditional type of cuisines, or do you think it's going to evolve more reflecting of what you're trying to actually do? Thank you.
I mean, that's a really good question. Because we all know about Flushing, most of the new immigrants here to New York from China are going to places like Flushing or Sunset Park. And so that's where a lot of northern style food, Sichuan style food, Yunnan style, like really regionally specific cuisines are coming to pop up. And because, well, how do I answer this? As we know, in Chinatown, in Manhattan Chinatown, a lot of that, those restaurants were opened by Fujianese and Cantonese people, and we're cooking a very southern style type of food. I think it's going to continue to be celebrated, if not more so, especially because of the younger generation that were raised in Manhattan Chinatown and continue to give it life and rebrand it and push it further. Xi'an famous foods, not Xi'an famous foods, that's from Flushing actually, but Nanhua is perhaps the best example of that. They kill it, it's amazing. And they will see expansion out of Manhattan Chinatown. But the other, I mean, at the end of the day, new Chinese restaurateurs are going to have to obey by the same laws of physics that every other type of restaurateur does. So they're opening in good places to open restaurants all over New York, like Midtown or Harlem or East Village. I think no longer will they be restricted by specific streets because that's where the family is. So perhaps more and more so, geography, at least in Manhattan, won't play as much of a role.
So Doron, as spokesperson for the Chinatown Mafia, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's, New York Chinatown, Manhattan Chinatown, it's, first generation, second generation, old Cantonese people. Now they have kids, and if they're still in the food business, they're speaking English, and they're moving to East Village or some other place where they can do not the Chinese business, but everyone else's business, and the education of Chinese food to a greater audience. I feel that in Flushing, Sunset Park, there are more first generation coming over, immigrating, so the food is still very authentic. But those communities tend to stick together because they can communicate with each other. Now the second and third generation in New York Chinatown, you can speak English very, very fluently. So they start to branch out. And that's why I see New York Chinatown kind of westernizing.
Questions?
Yes, hi, my name is Tony, and you've already talked a lot about what I want to ask about, but this year, what do you see as the new trends that might happen this year that you are anticipating or you're waiting to jump on top of? Yeah, no secrets. No.
Chili,
Not me.
chili oil becoming the next sriracha. You heard it here first.
Specific. I mean, we were just talking about this in the room. Like, I'd love to see more Yunnan food. I love Yunnan food, and I think it's such a good bridge between understanding Chinese food and Southeast Asian food. I think that'd be so interesting to see. I'm personally rooting for them.
Yeah, that was
Yeah.
I want to see more Xinjiang. Skewers like Xinjiang cuisine is like underrepresented.
Xinjiang.
What questions?
Bing's, right?
Bing.
Like Mr. Bing.
Right there.
Hi, my name is Mike. If you think about who your competition is, to what extent do you think about it in terms of cuisine, other Asian or Chinese restaurants, and to what extent do you think in terms of a price point or a decor, an experience, a location?
Probably pretty different for you guys, but for us, our goal is to make Chinese food every day. Accessibility means that you should eat it regularly. So we see ourselves next to places like Big and Sweet Green, Chipotle, Chops, that sort of thing. That's why we're picking specifically a certain type of food that has balance and is a little bit healthy and has sort of like inherent permutation so that it can change over time and it's highly seasonal. That's the type of food that we like to see because of our mission at our restaurant group. But for a sit-down restaurant where you have more command of people's attention and more narrative ability, I think it'd probably be a little bit different.
For us, we rarely compare ourselves with other Chinese restaurants. In fact, we rarely compare ourselves with any other restaurants in general, just because in my head, you're as good as your competitors. So if you're competing with yourself or like the last year of yourself, that's probably a better approach. And I would love to see, like, just in Chinese restaurants in general, if we're I guess if you're comparing and try to like achieve any level, it'll be nice to, if one day we can achieve the French cuisine level in New York, where like when you're going out for a French food, you're just going out for food. If you're going for Italian meal, you're just going out for a meal. So if we can get to that point, then that would be a really good thing for Chinese food.
Yes.
Here you go. Sorry.
Yep.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Jamie Louie. I do PR for the China United States Exchange Foundation, and my question is about pushing the boundaries between what is seen as orthodox and unorthodox food, specifically within Chinese cuisine. And I really like Lucas's analogy about the diagram, how you pinpoint yourself on that spectrum between Americanized food or Chinese food, and especially with the rise of ethnic food as a trend or something. I'm curious how you guys integrate unorthodox foods like offal, like intestines or chicken heart, like you said. So I think it's sometimes it's a very intimate kind of food. You have a lot of personal, cultural memories to that, but maybe that your other counterparts can't really understand. Thank you.
Yeah, we do a lot of chicken hearts and gizzards and chives and all of that, and you just have to have it being a dry pot restaurant, and I think whoever that's willing to accept it will accept it, and then whoever is willing to learn about it will learn about it, and slowly it'll transfer to that part of the world who, the people that didn't really have any knowledge about those exotic ingredients and all of that. And also you need, I guess we're here to create a bridge between the people who are familiar with their own food and the people who aren't so familiar. So like, it's necessary to have bok choy, and it's also just as important to have chicken heart on your menu. If that, aligns with their cuisine, obviously.
We'll take two more questions. Yeah.
Hi, my name's Cindy. My question is, I have a lot of Chinese cookbooks, but most of them are by Fuxia Danielle, and she's amazing.
Yeah.
But she's a white lady, so I think there's a lot of missing, whether you are Chinese or American Chinese, Canadian Chinese, in the sort of Chinese food media landscape, or they're hawking something that's very, very stereotypically Chinese. So is there any plans for any of you to do more in the media, just to get the new generation going?
Yeah. There needs to be more representation in the media, especially because that dictates culture in a lot of ways, dictates people's tastes. There are a few really great Chinese American journalists that write about food. Clarissa Wei is one of them. I don't know if you follow her on Twitter. She's really worth a follow. And yeah, me personally, I've been writing about Chinese food for a long time, and there are plans to write a Sichuan cookbook.
Yeah, I mean, to continue on the line of shout-outs, there's Gold Thread, owned by China More
Clarissa
Voices.
works with
Clarissa works with Gold Thread, incredible stuff. The other one is, some of you might know Wang Gang. Is that ringing a bell? Wang Gang is a chef from Sichuan, from Zigong, who's been just posting videos of himself cooking, and he's massive in China. He's just recently started posting on YouTube, so you can look up Wang Gang. And you find this stuff, and he's like doing toads and rats, but also like the stuff that you eat in Zigong, but also like spicy chicken and like typical like potato slices and that sort of thing. And so slowly, there's going to be media that is coming from China and being produced in China for Chinese audiences that are going to find an audience in the West as it sort of like leaps over the Great Firewall. So that's really exciting. Our personal goal in the mid to short midterm is to be able to bring more chefs and more voices to China to see what's happening in China. I personally cook for a month, I call it my sabbatical, tell my boss. In China, I cook for a month every year in China, and always picking different cities, and you cook and you stage and you learn about things, and you come back and all your friends here in the US like, what did you learn? Oh my goodness, I'd love to see. And you realize that they don't have a chance of going on their own because nothing is translated for them. None of the language is the same, none of the culture translates. The setup of the kitchen is different, all the basic fundamentals that they had as a French or Italian cook, for example, wouldn't apply in China. So I would love to bring a bunch of chefs and like go see parts of China and try to see how just seeing the wonder of Chinese food, trying to find what that influence is on the restaurants back over here. Some of you might know Ferran Adria, who used to be, best chef in the world of LUE. He famously said that if it weren't for the Cultural Revolution, Chinese food would definitely be the food all that we're eating today. It's far, in terms of technique, has superseded French cuisine. It's so much more deep, it's so much more complex, but we seem to have sharp results into the so I do believe that, and I think technique-forward, ingredient-forward cooking is always going to carry food media.
I would also like to see more of shows that we watched tonight. Like, I think there needs to be more, visual representation as well, not just words on a piece of paper, but people need, it needs to become more normalized in order to bridge, and so, yeah, hopefully Netflix sees this. Are there more episodes?
Mm-hmm. Yes, this is season 3, and there's 6 episodes. It's aired nationally on PBS.
When does it start?
So it starts February 5th, which is Chinese New Year. Yeah. So I think you guys are doing a great job, really, the new Chinese food revolution, people are always saying. Why is Chinese food all of a sudden so popular these days? And I think it's because there's great representation who can speak about it, who are stepping outside of the kitchen. Fuchsia Dunlop, she's one of my favorite cookbook authors as well, but she was really, there weren't a lot of English-speaking cookbook authors going to Sichuan at the time that she was writing about it. And so that's all changing thanks to this new generation of Chinese mafia.
Maybe we'll just call it an evening because I know I want to make everybody on time. My voice tends to boom, but I'll just say I'm James Heimowitz. I'm the president of China Institute, and I wanted to say a big thank you and actually add a little personal note. My connection to China Institute began with my grandmother, who took cooking lessons here at China Institute back in the day when we taught that. And that tradition's coming on. I've just come back from Sichuan, actually, where I met the head of the Provincial Culinary Association. And he was lamenting across China, actually, how the regional cuisines have lost their way, lost their identity, and classic dishes such as shangrosi, which you may know, are unrecognizable, served in Sichuan restaurants in Shanghai or Beijing or Guangzhou because they've just become sort of homogenized.
Sichuan elitist chefs, like I love that.
Yeah.
This is the proper way.
But I will tell you that I previously met a similar one from Guangdong, and he will tell you, Guangdong food for the rest of China has become a gloppy mess. And it's not true to the clean styles that Guangdong is, and it's basically the homogenization of foods. But I don't want to go on another program. I just wanted to say there'll be lots more to explore at China Institute through our up-and-coming culinary programs. For those of you who don't know, we're building out downstairs. We've recently raised over $7 million to help with that expansion. So soon we'll be building out to the ground floor, have a main entrance coming in. And one of the things that we're fundraising for now is actually trying to get a demonstration kitchen space so that we'll have professional demonstration space back to our roots of that. So hopefully that will come to life soon. So on that note, I know that we're going to be eager to try some of the sampling, the condiments as well as the dumplings and everything else. But I just wanted to end this portion of the evening with a thank you first to Ellie for all her efforts in pulling this together, and her team, and for everybody for work on the programming, to our co-sponsors and hosts, the Confucius Institute Hanban, Sub China, of course Lucky Chow, and all of you on stage. A big thank you from all of us at China.